Hey guys, in this section we're going to be really looking at our second batch of factoring. So this one is where things kind of get tough. So it might take us a little bit of time, and that is a-okay with me. We are in no hurry because this is one of those really big important skills. Okay, so we looked last time in our last section at some pretty simple quadratics where my a value, remember that a value is that thing in front of the x squared, was 1. So now things are not going to be so easy. Okay, we're going to add a little more complication. So let's walk through example number 1 together. So I see here I've got 3x squared plus 9x minus 12 equals 0. So the first step I notice when we're factoring, right, is that everything is to one side and I've set my equation equal to 0, right? That's the first thing we have to do. So the next question I'm going to ask myself is there something I can take out of every term? And I mean every term, not just the first couple, I mean every term. So the thing I notice with this one is that each of my numbers is divisible by 3. So I'm going to go ahead and factor out a 3. So what that looks like is I'm kind of unmultiplying, right? I'm going to say really unmultiplying rather than dividing, because dividing with variables gets gross and yucky. But remember, we're unmultiplying because we're doing the distributive property backwards. That's really what factoring is we're undistributing. So if I take out a 3, the thing I'm left with from this first term, I'm really kind of dividing, but kind of not dividing. 3 divided by 3 is 1, but that x squared is still there. 9 divided by 3 gives me 3, but my x is still there. Negative 12 divided by 3 gives me that negative 4 equals 0. Oh, so now that I've got it like this looks like something that I could factor based on what we did in the last section. So I'm going to take my c value and figure out all of my ways that I could get a negative 4. Well, I know that I could have negative 1 times a positive 4, or a 1 times a negative 4, or I could have a negative 2 times a positive 2. Those are my only real possibilities. So when I add them, I get a 3, negative 3, and 0. So the thing I'm looking for here is that positive 3, which would be right here. So I end up with that 3 doesn't really go anywhere. I've got x minus 1 and x plus 4. These two things from right in here. Well, so now that I've done that, I can set each piece equal to 0. This 3 out front doesn't actually matter because 3 doesn't equal to 0, and I can't solve for an x there. So we can just kind of ignore it. Sometimes you'll be pulling out an entire x, and then you'll go ahead and set that equal to 0. So for now, I've got x minus 1 equals 0, and x plus 4 equal to 0. So I would add my 1 and subtract my 4. So x equals 1 and x equals a negative 4. So those would be your two solutions. So I want you to look over here at example 2, right? Example 2 is very similarly done. We noticed that we could pull out a 5 from each of our values. So we're going to do that first. So now let's look at example number 3. I'm going to walk through two different ways to do example 3. One of them is the way that is shown here. So I'm going to explain what's being done because that'll help a lot. And then there's another way to do it. And I don't care which way you do it. Pick the way that makes the most sense to you. Okay, so I have here, I've got 2x squared plus 3x minus 5 equals 0. And if it takes me a minute to explain this part, is because this is not how I learned how to do this. I learned how to do this a way more long and gross and complicated way. So this is actually really cool that there's more than one way to do this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my a value and my c value and multiply them together. But before I do that, I have to go back and double check. Is everything to one side and I'm set equal to 0? Yep. Is there something I can divide out or I can factor out of each and every term? Well, I've got a 2 and I've got a 3 and a 5, and there's no number that can go into all of those evenly, so nope, I'm stuck. So that's where I now come to these steps that I'm going to do. So I go ahead and I multiply those together to kind of simplify. So I've got x squared plus 3x. My b term, my second term stays the same, minus 10. So this minus 10 I got from multiplying these two things together. Well, now that is something that I could factor, right? So I want to find all of my factors of a negative 10. So I've got negative 1 times 10, or 1 times a negative 10, or I've got a negative 2 times 5, or 2 times a negative 5. When I add them, I get 9, negative 9, 3, and negative 3. I see according to my quadratic, I want this negative 3. So now I'm going to have my x minus 2 and my x plus 5. Okay, I'm not quite done yet though. That's the thing, is when this a value is not 1, I have a couple of extra steps. So when I went and multiplied this, right, I've changed something. So now in order to like unchange that, I'm going to go ahead and like undo what I did. So I multiplied, so now I'm going to divide both of these by 2. So here's where things get a little funky, right? I can multiply a negative 2 by 2, that is fine. So here I'm going to end up with x minus 1. 5 cannot be nicely divided by 2. So I'm going to go ahead and move this 2 out front. So I've got 2x plus 5. Okay, so that's always going to happen. One of your two values will be divisible and the other one won't. So the one that's not, you're going to go ahead and move that denominator out front of your variable. Now I'm pretty simplified, so now I can go ahead and set each piece equal to 0. So I've got x minus 1 equals 0 and 2x plus 5 equals 0. So I just add 1, so x equals 1. Subtract my 5, so 2x equals 5, and then divide by 2. So x equals 5 over 2. And go ahead and leave it as this fraction too. Okay, so now I've done it that way. Okay, this way will always work. So it's a really good strategy. If you're like me, I like to have more than one strategy. So I'm going to go ahead and walk you through a different way to do this same problem. But, whoa, I'm going to need more space. So let me insert a page. Okay, so I'm going to rewrite my problem. So I've got 2x squared plus 3x minus 5. This is still not how I was taught, because I won't even tell you how I was taught, because it was awful and long and gross and doesn't make sense to anybody. So what I'm going to do, oh, and I forgot equals 0. Because again, step 1, make sure everything is to one side and I have set my equation equal to 0. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to multiply these two things together, which will give me a negative 10. Okay, similar step, but we're going to do something a little bit different with it. So I'm going to say negative 1 times 10, or 1 times a negative 10, or 2 times a negative 5, or negative 2 times a positive 5. And again, I'm going to add them. And still I'm trying to get 3. But here I'm actually going to be separating and splitting that middle term. That's what I'm doing. So I can do some factoring by grouping. So these two pieces, let me just get a different color because sometimes that helps. So 2x squared and my minus 5 stay the same. So now this becomes a minus 2x and a plus 5x. Okay, so all I've done is I've taken that middle term and split it by doing these same factoring steps that I've done before. Okay, so now I'm going to, we call this factor by grouping. So I'm going to group my first couple terms and I'm going to group my second couple of terms. So now I can say, okay, what can I factor out of this first group? Well, I see they're both divisible by a 2 and they both have an x in it. So I can factor out a 2x. So the thing I'm then left with, I'm left with 1x there. And I'm left with a 1 right here. Don't forget this 1, it can't go away, it's still there. Okay, because if I was to give you this and say multiply this in, you could do that. So now let's look at our second set. What can I take out of this? Well, both are divisible by 5, so let's go ahead and factor that out. So here I'm left with x minus 1. Now I know I've done this correctly because the things inside my parentheses are the same. If they're not the same, we know something screwed up there. So that stuff that was inside my parentheses becomes one of my factors. The stuff that's outside my parentheses becomes my other one. And if you'll notice, that looks really familiar to what we just had here. We had an x minus 1 and a 2x plus 5. So we got the same thing. So now again, I would follow my steps and set this equal to 0. And set this piece equal to 0. And then solve. So my x would still equal 1. And my x would still equal a negative 5 over 2. And I can always use Desmos to double check this, because remember it's going to be where my graph crosses the x-axis. Okay, so those are your two different ways to solve a quadratic by factoring if the a value is not 1, if it's something else. Okay, so now here's, oh geez, I need to stop doing that. here's a bunch of examples for you. Oh, and we're definitely not there yet. I went way too far. So now here's a bunch for you to try as these examples, and I'm going to leave this here for a second, so go and pause the video and make sure that you do them right. Remember that your goal is to try them first and just to double check. So then as you keep going through these examples, here's our next little batch. And no, you don't have to do every example here and then do all of your homework. Remember that your goal for me is to just start to feel comfortable doing this stuff. And this one I told you is going to take a while, and that's okay. Okay, so there's the last bit of examples here. But go ahead and pause and make sure that you're doing these ones correctly. And either way, I don't care if you do the first method I showed you or the second method, because you'll get the same thing no matter what. So once you've worked through these examples, definitely try a couple on your homework. See if you can follow along these too, but make sure that you're feeling comfortable with this factoring, right? Whether that A value is 1 or if that A value is something other than 1, because you'll see these either way. As always, contact me, send me a Skype, whatever, whenever you get stuck, and I would love to do a Google Meet with you or walk you through any of these. Just remember, you guys got this.